Hey there, my name is Alex. I'm the Silvermont. I like Dark Souls, and I've played a lot of MMOs, too many, perhaps. But right now, I'm playing a lot of Final Fantasy XIV and it got me thinking, along with some comments I received on some other videos, what if there was a Dark Souls MMO? How would you translate the spirit, or soul, if you will, and the mechanics into a massively multiplayer online environment? Now, just as a disclaimer, I'm not saying I necessarily want this, or even that it's a good idea, but it's interesting to think about. How would they go about it? And of course, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Now, the way I see it, there's two main aspects to MMOs, the personal side and the social side. The two are interwoven, to an extent, interlinked. Most MMOs are about creating your character and continuously improving them. There needs to be a drive that keeps you always advancing, always progressing, because if you're not going forwards, you're standing still. And standing still is clearly bad. This plays into the social aspect in that people like to be unique. Obviously, this isn't the case for everyone, but most people like to stand out. If there is a rare sword that can only be obtained from an extremely hard boss, you bet your ass people will want to get it, if only so they can hold it up in the middle of the city to show off, like, look at me, I am special, you are peasants. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't happen in Dark Souls. You would be wrong. You just need to look at any Dark Souls video on the internet, go down to the comments, and there will be a, ha, you didn't one-shot the final boss on day of release whilst naked at level 1 using nothing but your feet to control the game. You're awful. I'm way better than you. You suck. So in that aspect of people being very competitive and wanting to show off, so to speak, yeah, Dark Souls is a natural fit there. So in a way, Dark Souls is both a great fit for an MMO and an awful one. The game already has some aspects of MMO behaviour, in that you'll often be playing by yourself, then stumble across another player, largely by chance, just because they are there and you are there, with random invasions or summons, similar to how you might be levelling in Stranglethorn Vale, then an undead rogue pops up and he puts things inside you, forcing you to dismantle him with a wreck bomb. Silly skeleton. And yet, the social aspect of MMOs always plays into things with guilds, raid groups, and all that sort of stuff. People hanging around in cities and talking to each other. Trading, crafting, you name it. Something that is a little at odds, perhaps, with the random, lonely nature of most Dark Souls intended interactions. They are rather impersonal by design. So you have a few problems when approaching the prospect of a Souls MMO. The main one of which, well, do you eschew the happenstance nature and adopt a more traditional approach? Later entries in the series certainly moved in that direction with password matchmaking and the like. And considering this isn't literally Dark Souls 1 in MMO format, but rather an MMO in the Dark Souls universe, I think you could go for that approach. You set it during a time before the fall, or during, as opposed to most of the Souls games which take place after all these catastrophes. We know there are large cities in the Souls world, after all, so on the one hand, yes, it would feel very bizarre to play a Dark Souls game with a bustling city full of players and such, but on the other hand, whilst it's very at odds with the other games, it might be interesting to see, as we've never seen any Dark Souls things before the collapse, because you might argue that is what makes those games. They are always set during these post-collapse scenarios. So, what cities could we have, though? Well, before we answer that, we need to have another question answered. How would the game be structured? To use two basic comparisons from the MMOs I've personally played the most of, 14 and WoW, the latter of which is split into two distinct factions who are fighting with each other, cannot play together. The former, 14, is everyone on the same side. PvP is more along the lines of skirmishes, or war games, or something like that. Frankly, you could go with either in Dark Souls. On the one hand, you could have a situation, say, where there's a few player cities or countries to choose from. Just as an example, let's take Astora and Kareem. Maybe in the story of this particular game, they are at war. Now, personally, I don't think that's a great option for role-playing and the like. A better one, I think, would be having the players not bound to factions, but more freelancers who can invade or fight other players at their discretion. There could be multiple cities, and perhaps at times in the story or for events, they would be at odds with each other. Maybe during the story there is an arc where, say, something happens and Kareem and Astora go to war, and you can choose to enlist with one of them or the other. Either way, there are a lot of cities and places that I know people would be interested in seeing. Astora, Kareem, Katarina, and so forth. Now of course, an important part of an MMO is a reason to keep playing. One thing that came to mind nearly immediately when I thought of that was, how have the Souls games tried replay value in the past? Well, for starters, there's different character builds. There's also the notion of random dungeons, such as the Bloodborne Chalice dungeons, which are semi-random. And I'll go ahead and say I think Chalice dungeons are pretty bad. Random is at odds with what made the dungeons in Dark Souls and Demon Souls and Bloodborne so memorable and fun. So I don't think it would be good to rely on just random dungeons. Rather, introducing new dungeons every now and then would be a far better idea. PvP, naturally, is something that people are very interested in with the Souls games, and that would be simple enough. You don't even really need to incentivize it with rewards or whatever, but it all fits quite naturally into an MMO environment. Now, Elden Ring, at the time I'm writing this, has just been announced, and at time of writing we don't know if there's PvP in it, and frankly I would be fine if PvP wasn't in Elden Ring, because the PvP formula in Dark Souls for me has gotten stale, but in an MMO I think it would work a lot better, because there is more a sense of permanency, and there can be proper consequences for all parties involved. You'd have people invading others, killing them, taking their souls, but you could also have more structured PvP, say, maybe, again to use Astora, they are hosting a tournament of knights or whatever, similar to arenas with seasons and ratings, so there'd be no killing involved from a story perspective, and the rewards would be different. And you wouldn't be seen as a villain, whereas if you're invading people, you might get put in some Dark Moon book of naughty kids, which, unlike in Dark Souls, it wouldn't really be an issue, because, you know, in Dark Souls, you can always just quit the game and just... there's no real sense of permanency, is what I'm getting at. But Covenants, of course, could also work with this setting and with PvP in general, because if you're in, say, a server, and you're known for always invading and killing people, well, you might start to get a bit of a reputation, which could be a positive or a negative depending on the way you look at it, and it could hinder you in other ways whilst you're playing that game. If I go boot up Dark Souls 1 right now, if I go invade someone and like kill them like 20 times, there's nothing from stopping me from the next day summoning people and continuing the game as normal. In an MMO environment, that could differ drastically. But then you have the question, what about non-combat roles? Well, I think there's a few ways you could tackle this. What if you can create undead characters as well as human ones? Undead would have very limited penalties upon dying, just, you know, losing your souls, or a percentage of your souls. Whereas humans should have far larger penalties for dying. Hell, you could even have permadeath, where if your human character dies, they're gone forever. Maybe you put in some sort of inheritance system, so that if you die, you can retrieve perhaps some of your items, or so forth, as part of, I don't know, you could have estates, wills, things like that. The way I see it though, humans would be used for more non-combat roles, crafting and trading, something that undead should be limited in. But why, you ask? What's stopping an undead from crafting and trading? Well, it could be simply that undead aren't trusted, but they are tolerated to some degree in human cities, and you can always play this into the story as well, having discrimination against the undead. They're in walled-off sections of the city, you know? They're second-hand citizens, ergo they are not allowed to be craftsmen, they're not allowed to be part of guilds and the like. And when I say guilds, I mean like a workman guild, not like a player guild. I have personally always liked the idea of combat and non-combat roles in an MMO working together and benefiting one another. If you're playing, say, a crafter, you don't also have to play a warrior. You can play the entire game as a crafter if you want to. A craftsman needs to sell his wares, and soldiers need armour and weapons. But then another very big and important part of MMOs is essentially killing dragons and watching as the dragon explodes into loot, so you can get yourself a shiny new sword. So of course there would have to be balance there, but upgrading and repairing your equipment in Dark Souls is just as important as finding that new sword in the first place. But I know what you're thinking. It would be a huge pain if we had to go to find another player every time we want to upgrade or repair our gear. So it could also be that craftsmen can make repair kits and upgrade kits. You know how in Dark Souls 1 from the blacksmith you can buy the stuff that lets you repair and upgrade at bonfires? Similar to that, but more limited use. More like, hey craftsman, I want to buy like 5 repair kits from you. And it allows you to use them out in the field. Likewise, soul attunement should be the work of these human characters. That should be something more like their kind of end game. You start as, a human smith, for example, you make armor. Eventually, you have some sort of, epic mystical quest, rendering you able to craft soul weapons and the like, more of your powerful stuff. But then, why would these crafters need the undead? Well, for a few reasons. A, they are customers, so you might want to tie it into something to do with that's how they get EXP, not just from crafting things, but also from having transactions. And you might say, oh, that's stupid, why would you level up from selling someone something? Well, you have to think of it in the sense that it is literally experience. You're getting experience in your area of expertise. Whereas the undead are getting experience in the form of absorbing souls from creatures they defeat. And B, the undead would be your protectors. Let's say you want to travel from city A to city B as a human. You're going to be largely defenseless, and if you die, you're going to suffer a large penalty, if not permanent death. So maybe you hire some undead players to protect you along the way. Or you could hire an undead and use them to transport your goods, but maybe that isn't someone you trust and they're just going to run off with it, so you'd rather do it by yourself, And to stop situations where, say, you're going from city A to B, and then an undead's going to say, oh sure, I'll help you, then what's going to stop them from turning around and backstabbing you? Well, in theory nothing, but you could have some sort of insurance in place, such as you would send ahead where you are going, when to roughly expect you, and so forth, and if you don't get there, well, no reward for the undead who's protecting you, and they might be put on, say, a list because, oh, well, they said they were going to help this guy get to the city, they, signed a contract or whatever, but they didn't arrive, so did he fail to protect him, or did he backstab him out in the wilds? Risk and reward, in any facet. It would be really fascinating to see how it would all play out, because in general, despite some people on the internet being rude, I think people generally tend towards cooperation for mutual benefit, and people who, play the bandit roles, they'll be shunned somewhat, so I don't know, I just think it'd be really interesting to see. Either way, if the undead are protecting you on your journey from A to B, if they die, the penalties are a lot more minimal and you can always compensate them for it. And of course you have currencies. Undead use souls as almost a universal currency, whereas humans need money. Souls aren't very useful for humans, and coin isn't that useful for undead, so when undead find, say, just miscellaneous treasure that they don't personally need, or money and coins in a dungeon, they can use it to repair, upgrade, and just trade with the human characters. Not exactly sure how the soul stuff could benefit humans at this point, but you always have this thing where, say, you don't necessarily need souls as a human, but you can use souls to do things. Say you've made a breastplate and you want to make it some sort of fire-resistant breastplate. Maybe you need to affix souls to it, so they're useful to you in that extent as well. I think you get the general idea of what I'm going for here though, I hope. The idea is to have mutually beneficial relationships, in a sense. You could also be a dick-ass undead who tries to murder everyone you come across, but again, then you'd have to be prepared for people trying to hunt you down. If you get put in the Book of the Guilty, maybe you wouldn't even be safe in certain hubs or cities. You might have to maintain your own little bandit camp out in the middle of some dangerous area where you're unlikely to be found by the Dark Moonblades. And that of course would have its own complications. I always thought it was absurd you can be some dishonourable PKer, player killer bandit, then just go into a city and no one, they're like, oh well, you're in a city so I guess you're safe now, even though we know all your crimes. If you want to go for the bandit playstyle, you've got to go all in. Maintain your own little bandit camps in like a cave or some mountains. Oh, maybe one day you'll see a bunch of Dark Moons riding up. Now, speaking of riding around, fast travel should be limited, but I think it should be there in some capacity. Soapstones to summon others, these should exist, but in a different format to how they are in the Souls games. You should be able to get permanent and temporary soapstones. Now, humans would craft the soapstones. Let's say they craft a small soapstone. It expires after X amount of uses. Let's say Bob crafts a small soapstone and gives it to Jim. Jim then signs the soapstone, which marks it as his, and then he can give it to Fred, who can then summon Jim 10 times before the soapstone, crumbles away. Whereas the larger soapstone, it would be one that never expires, but it would also be a little harder to obtain. Jim gives that to one of his friends as opposed to Fred, who's just some random he's been playing with for a day. Undead characters would be able to fast travel using bonfires, but these wouldn't be everywhere, and they wouldn't be in the big cities. Maybe they'd be near the cities, but of course, the big cities, they don't want undead being able to teleport into the middle of their cities. But yes, undead would be able to fast travel in a capacity using some bonfires, whereas humans would need to manually travel on foot. And I like the idea of there being different routes between areas. There could be shorter, more dangerous routes and longer, safer ones. The main thing would be player freedom and choice. Maybe some group of players would want to make their own sort of undead guild of patrolsmen who, they just patrol these certain routes and help out people they see because, they want to be nice. Maybe another group are doing the opposite and they're being highwaymen and they're trying to rob that route, and, things would evolve over time and it'd be interesting to see how the community forms. If a player wanted to be a human combat character, they could go for it, but they would of course have a harder time than the undead, especially when it comes to death penalties. It's like, would you risk it? What about combat? It's a very big part of the Souls games, and how would you adapt it to an MMO? Well, I think you keep the basic idea of leveling up and determining your class that way. Would you have a level cap? Or would you just let people continuously level and level until they hit like level 700, but maybe they de-level when they die enough? I like the idea of there being no hard set classes, but more like how you play determines your class. And also being able to reinvest your souls to change your stats. Again, that's another thing. Humans could craft like a sort of phylactery that the undead can store all their souls in, almost like a bank, and they could make ways for undead to redistribute their souls to level up. Melee's always been the core of the game, either way. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think an MMO would have to make the other facets a little more in-depth to balance the game in a superior manner. Magic's generally been laughably bad in Souls games, or just a way to cheese things with excessive amounts of damage. Of course, we don't need a traditional MMO trinity of, tank, healer, DPS, but those roles do exist in Dark Souls. No reason they wouldn't work here either. You might just need to slightly enhance the effects of items like the Red Eye Ring, that make you more likely to be targeted. Magic, MP, mana, FP, whatever you want to call it, it should regenerate, for sure. As a matter of fact, I like the idea of a system that somewhat combines Demon Souls and Dark Souls. In essence, there should be some magic spells that you can use indefinitely as long as you have the mana. Let's say Soul Arrow. It uses mana, but your mana will gradually regenerate. But there should also be higher tier spells that are limited, and they only replenish, at bonfires, like how magic works in Dark Souls 1. Those would be for your more powerful spells. Weapon arts, to some extent, can return, but I think we could work in some new system that's taking the best parts of Dark Souls 2 power stancing, Dark Souls 3 weapon arts, and the combat arts from Sekiro to make something new and better. But how about mounted combat? Not sure if I like that idea or not. On the one hand, it would be interesting to see, because MMOs generally do have mounts, and Elden Ring is going to have mounts, so we'll see how the combat works in that. But they also exist in most MMOs just to make you move faster. Dark Souls maps have always been designed about intricately designed small areas, not giant empty fields you want to zoom through. And then you also have to keep in mind that maybe mounts are more useful for humans, as it's going to allow them to try and escape. But it's also something they would have to maintain. I don't like the idea of just summoning one from nowhere. Just blowing a whistle when a mount magically appears out of thin air. I'm not a huge fan of that. Then of course there's player customization, especially important in an MMO. Dark Souls always had a nice system of letting you mix and match armour. No reason that should go. Armour dies, of course we want those to be included. I also like the idea of having your own relic weapon that is somewhat unique to you. Let's say 2 players start out with longswords. Basic longsword they obtained from the same human player, who made the same weapon twice, for all intents and purposes. He made a bunch of them and he's selling them to undead. A few months down the line, they would have evolved into more unique weapons, due to the way the players have upgraded them, used them, and attuned with them. I've always liked the idea of having one weapon that you steadily enhance over time, compared to, say, the WoW method of obtaining the true dragon blending Sword of Pain, only to drop it in the trash can in the next expansion, because you now have Axle Flame, unending agony of orc splitting, It's like, oh, you have this epic sword, but this new one's like 5 item levels higher, so it renders the old one obsolete. There's a good balance you can have here. Dark Souls already has it in some capacity. Long swords in Dark Souls are generally just as effective as a boss assault weapon, so you just need ways to keep the player invested. Give them goals to be reaching for, to let them evolve their weapon over time. One smith might have created it, but then maybe another smith is going to upgrade it down the line and make it a soul fire weapon, This would be for not just stats and stuff like that, but also for the visuals. Maybe one person wants to have a really gaudy sword, whereas the other one wants to have a very basic looking sword, but despite that it's very powerful because it has been, tempered in dragon blood or something. Overall, I think the main problem with the Dark Souls themed MMO, the general idea of it sounds good, but the more I think about it, the less I feel some sort of infinite grinding stuff fits with Dark Souls. Keeping players playing every day, giving them goal after goal. What would work better in my eyes is almost something like one of those semi-persistent, almost MMO games. I hesitate to say Destiny, but something a bit like Destiny. Or one of those open world survival games with a lot of people in. Not saying it should be an open world survival game, but one of those games that's almost an MMO, but not quite. No subscription, you buy the game and then maybe you can, purchase either expansion packs, or you could have like an in-game store. I don't know what the best way to do it would be. But when online games reach the point of we need to come with arbitrarily long, time-gated reasons to keep the player engaged, that's where Dark Souls wouldn't really work, in my opinion. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Take care.